this is part two. We had already discussed some of the preliminary material. Uh, it's interesting, this paper. It's kind of divided into two sections. One section, sort of the first 5 pages, is like a bunch of words. And then the second section is kind of like the actual mathematical definition. And in my opinion of it,
Real quick.
oh, to the paper, you should find that in the Slack channel, the Journal Club Slack channel.
Yeah, see it on the video, and I'll send it. I was going to send it for Brian.
Okay. And I'm gonna follow through the paper the whole time. If you can you see that it's shared on my screen? And is that font size legible enough? Okay. Okay, so the goal here really is we have a prover and a verifier, and we want to convince the verifier that the prover knows some secret. And the interesting part, or like the challenge behind it, is that we want to do this without exchanging any information. So neither party should have any state changes after the fact. And so that's what this whole thing is about. This is more of like the mathematical side of it and like the abstract definitions. We're not necessarily going to get into like algorithms of how to do it. But, let's see. I think there might be a couple things that I can comment on just from, our discussion last time if I go through this. So that's what I was just saying. One thing kind of just to comment on this efficient algorithm, and I think maybe I didn't talk about this, perfectly in an exactly proper way last time, but just to say, the way this is defined, or this is the way this is considered among, like research professionals, is that there's no point in discussing something unless there's an efficient algorithm. So the significance of this efficient algorithm stuff is that unless there's a polynomial time solution to your protocol that a computer can do it while we all wait, there's no point in discussing it. And so they essentially just even at the level of the proofs, exclude things that, if it's going to take a whole lifetime to compute it, well, it just doesn't even make any sense to discuss it. So some things, sometimes you'll see, discussion around, well, there could be an algorithm that, was in NP time or something like that. So that's not impossible by these definitions. But the reason they're creating this is it's the practical side of the definition to say we have to have a polynomial time solution. And that's what this efficient algorithm means. Okay, and then last time I talked about, there's these two different cases of errors that can occur. So really the game is going to be, can we send the information, in a protocol? And what's, really fascinating and interesting is we want to be able to do it in a probabilistic way. So we're going to, roll dice and send challenges at random, and we're going to sample some distribution. And the idea is that the verifier should be able to see that distribution. And if there's enough challenges, they can identify the distribution. And there should be something special about the distribution, a signal that reveals the information that they want to exchange, right? So it's going to be a probabilistic type of exchange of information. And that's really what this is all getting down to. But anyway, as I was saying earlier, there's kind of two parts of the paper. There's like the words part and the formalism part. And last time we did the words part, and I almost think the words part is more challenging. The formalism kind of just makes sense. And so I think we'll be able to kind of go through this more quickly than the discussion played out last time. So let me get into this. So here's the formalism. And this kind of like sets up the definition that they're going to eventually give to us. So we're going to just start out with a binary relationship. What does that mean? We're going to return true or false. Very easy. We're going to consider some operation, like I just said, it's polynomially bounded, right? We don't want to consider exhaustive searching that takes forever. Somebody could consider that, but it's not practical for us in building protocols. So basically what we're going to say is I'm going to challenge you, I'm the verifier. The verifier is going to be a very important party in this whole thing. And then there's a prover. And if the verifier is honest, you really don't even need to have the prover be honest in particular, because if the protocol works, the prover should just be able to answer these challenge, and we should be able to exchange the information properly, yes or no. So it's always going to be a true or false. I'm going to send you the challenge, and you're going to say yes, it's a member, or no, it's not a member, true or false. So that's what we want to set up. Let's set up this relation that we're going to share, and there's going to be essentially whether or not you accept or reject that particular challenge. And so it's interesting because, so what we want to do is say for each common input, and I'm looking at this definition too, 2.1, there's going to be a probability distribution on the input space, and we're going to consider what happens for some random value. So you could think about this like if it was the normal distribution, and I could send you 0, right? And you should return to me, the top point. And I could send you 1, and you could send me, the 0.6 point, right? And I could send you -1, right? And then you would
Distribution exists on the distribution exists on the outputs or the inputs?
The distribution is on the output. So this is a function of the inputs that we're returning the outputs. And this probability distribution is very important because it's essentially what we're going to use to decide if there's a signal there. So we're going to use this challenge response approach. And if we have a probability distribution, we can use that to determine the probability that I agree with you, right? Because if I just send you like one question and you say true or false, well, then it could be like a 50-50 toss-up, right, on whether or not I agree with you that that's the distribution. But if I keep challenging you over time, I should be able to drive that probability as low as I would want to in polynomial time to determine whether or not that's the distribution. So that's the game we're playing. Okay, so we're going to consider kind of like two parties in the protocol, the prover and the verifier. And as I've said, the verifier is kind of the important one. The verifier is the one that's challenging the prover to reveal information, and the authenticity of the verifier is maybe more important than the authenticity of the prover. And then what we're going to do is exactly what I've been describing. And so there's like a sequence of moves, right? So the verifier is going to send to the prover, here's a challenge. And the prover is going to respond, okay, here's my answer to your challenge. And this is going to essentially evolve into a transcript. And the overall transcript you could think of as the proof, right? So if any one of these things, right, maybe has a low probability. So if it's a coin flip, maybe that just has a 50-50 probability. But if it's 10 coin flips in a row, right, then you would expect there's some probability like 1 out of 1,000 about, right, that you would expect the probability to start getting pushed down. And you can keep pushing it down as low as you would want. And so the idea is that given this transcript coming from the prover and the verifier, that essentially is going to become the proof. So that's what this is saying about these probabilistic choices for the interactive functions.
And a quick example would be like trying to ground it a little bit, like trying to guess the one I talked to a couple of times ago was like trying to guess the color of a ball behind someone's back when you don't believe they're differently colored, I guess, and if they keep saying the same ball.
Right. So the non-color blindness test. So let's say I have two balls, right? And I flip they're in an order, red, green, and then I flip a coin. And if I flip the coin in its heads, I'm gonna flip the order. And if I flip the coin in its tails, I'm gonna keep the order. And so I flip the coin, and it determines one state, either flipped or not, and then I send it to the prover, sorry, and the prover is going to say flipped or not, true or false, right? And so on the first one, they have a 50-50 chance to guess it right? And so then they send me back true or false. and I look at it and I say, oh, I agree with you, it's flipped. So now we have one sample, one statistic, probability 50-50. I do it again, I flip my coin, either flipped or not, I send it to you, I ask you, is it flipped, right? And so then I can do the second one, and then this gives me a 1 out of 4. If it's still successful, it gives me a 1 out of 4 confidence, right? And I can keep doing this, driving down at that like 2 to the n, for the n being the number of flips probability for this protocol. And so I should be able to, in a very short amount of time, 10, 20 flips, be able to verify that I believe that you are not colorblind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what we're saying, what's this part of the paper is saying, is that those sequences of flips and responses is called the transcript. And there's going to be a transcript from both directions, right? So, and then that sequence we could essentially constitute as the proof. Because if you write down, okay, it's flipped, flipped, not flipped, not flipped, flipped, and then somebody says, true, false, true, 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 right? Then those two things, you can take those as the whole, and that's how you can develop whether or not you believe the person is not colorblind. And that's what we're saying here. The transcript contains the verifier's verdict on whether or not to accept or reject. So the verifier is just basically, I accept means that, I see it as flipped. Rejected means I don't agree. So what, if somebody's just cheating, right, you would imagine that they would just send you back a random, Poisson distribution for, flipping a coin, right? And then that wouldn't match up, right? And so then that would be something it doesn't accept the transcript, right? So what this is, so this is saying that the probability is that the probability that the transcript is in the space of the possible outcomes, right? So if I give you this transcript of flip, 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 there should be only one set of possible outcomes of what you see that's correct. And so what's the probability that that's in that space? And that's exactly what we're describing. Okay, so let's look at definition 2. So we want to introduce this concept of a knowledge extractor. So the knowledge extractor is just this machine that can do this process. So the probabilistic machine that we're talking about is this like coin flipping process that can be challenged. And you have some function. This is the interactive function, is the one that we're evaluating, something that can be evaluated in polynomial time to answer the question. Do you accept it or do you reject it? And then we're just going to take and assign random variables. That's what we mean by flipping the coin. We'll just sample the space because our goal is to find the overall probability distribution. And this will return essentially whether it's accepted or rejected. So this is the kind of the machine that does this process and determines the answer. Okay, and then last time we talked a lot about like negligible versus non-negligible. So here is like a practical definition of it. And so we can kind of go through this. We call a function negligible if for all n, so lots of coin flips, we have the function is less than the signal. So what we were asking for before was that there's some polynomial number of steps that you can execute, that you can drive the probability down below some, n to the whatever, minus c, like the number of like say it's, quadratic, so c equals 2, you're asking it to be driven down quadratically, right? So the idea is if a function is negligible, it kind of like never shows up in your probability. Like the idea is that it's not you're not sampling any signal, right? So you can just run this function and it's always under the amount that we've set to expect for the probability. So it's kind of like saying it was like always zero. It doesn't have to be zero. It can just be negligible, right? So it's always like the signal is like close to zero. So this means that that function is kind of like, you could think of it as almost ignorable. Uh, there's another case where, let's say, there's a non-negligible function that also exists. So this might be from like a fake signal or a false positive signal. So you can imagine, people could get lucky, right? Like, maybe I don't know if the color blindness thing is still a good example, but if somebody guessed correctly, 4 times in a row, right, which wouldn't be that rare, like what is it, 1 out of 16 times, right? Like it's not that rare. So you could start to see that there's a non-negligible signal, even though the actual underlying distribution is not revealing anything. It's just a random distribution. That might not be the greatest example because you could also think of like a much more complicated example, like a multi-round encryption protocol or something like that that has potentially internal flaws that would have like maybe fake signals, right? Ciphertext attacks, the same thing encrypts to the same output, things like that, problems with random distributions. So that would be like non-negligible cases. So we're considering here like not cases that prove the situation, but like error cases, cases that we could consider that just produce noise, like negligible stuff, and also things that might produce false signals. So that's what this negligible and non-negligible is talking about. And it's important to consider, that's kind of one of the things that this paper is doing, is introducing this concept, because previous papers didn't really discuss it, or said that it could be ignored, or said that it could be set aside from the problem. And the problem is really like from the non-negligible side, there is this like common ciphertext attack where people search for a challenge, a ciphertext where two certain plain text would encrypt to the same ciphertext, and this could potentially occur. And if this is a weakness of the algorithm or the protocol that we're building, then we shouldn't expect this to be a good protocol, because somebody could do that and then undermine the protocol. This here, there's some like mathematical lingo, and I think what it's basically saying is that the idea is if the maximum thing from your signal is smaller than the distribution, right? That's saying that it's negligible. So this is basically putting what I just said in words to kind of like mathematical terms. And this is saying if the minimum thing from your signal is larger than kind of the probability that you're expecting, then it's non-negligible. So this is just kind of a mathematical way to say those same things. So finally, we're going to come to the mathematical definition. So here we have it. So our aim is to define proofs of knowledge over this space of binary relations, right? That I'm going to challenge you and you're going to return a true or false statement. For simplicity, we're saying polynomial relations, right? So we're just restating the groundwork again. So there's some special cases, just going to ignore that for now. But the heart of the proof system is going to be the verifier. And we're not going to consider, fake verifiers or cheating verifiers. We kind of like, I think then the verifier is kind of like our point of view. And it's the prover that's the one that could be the cheater that we want to restrict. The verifier, we're going to assume, is going to sort of faithfully execute the protocol that we're going to set forward. And it can interact with these arbitrary provers with different properties, different characteristics. And so, yeah, again, I know we've said this a couple times now, we're asking to restrict the verifier to probabilistic polynomial time. And this is a whole kind of, this probabilistic is just, I just want to point it out, it's like, it's a whole interesting area to research because it's, I'm sure, we're all familiar with doing proofs in like high school and college, and I'm sure none of us ever did probabilistic proofs. We probably wrote these kinds of like analytical definitions, right, where you carry forward from some facts and assumptions to some, ultimately information that you could deduce from those facts and assumptions. And it was probably using more of like an algebraic, or symbolic logic proving structure. So this is a wholly new way to prove that's only exists since the 1980s. So it's kind of cool to think about that this is like using this new way to prove things, and that we would even consider that, given that what Euclidean geometry probably has like 2,000-year history on this. Anyway, so it's just an interesting side topic.
That is pretty wild. Have you ever gone through a probabilistic proof?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's kind of like what we were just doing, right? The coin flipping. I think this is something that a machine would do, right? A human would probably still prefer, and don't get me started. I'll start talking about string theory or something. But humans still probably prefer the analytic proving process, right? Because it has such an elegant feeling of a conclusion. And I think there's probably always some feeling of doubt, right? Like it's like consider like hash collisions, right? That's always bothers people, that there's a tiny probability that it might not be true. Okay, so we wish to define the knowledge of P about some fact, which may be deduced from the interaction of the prover with the verifier. So the knowledge contains the transcript of the interaction. So the case of the interaction is accepting of the event or the knowledge of the prover. Okay, so this is kind of complicated, but it's essentially just a restatement that once we have the full transcript, we can believe the transcript, right? Because we've driven the probability down to whatever our accepting level is. And then we can say that it's not an accident, that the prover knows this, right? It's aha, the lightning strike. The prover has to know this information because we've challenged them 1,000 times, and 2 to the 1,000 is a number that we can't even imagine. So namely, the ability of the prover often leads to the verifier to accept may say something about the knowledge of P. Okay, so now we're getting into the idea of zero knowledge, right? And so it's important to think about the knowledge of the prover about the fact deduced by what we're doing can be captured by some function that's efficiently computed on the fact. And so P has access to it. So this is just a more formalized way to restate. And that's essentially what the knowledge extractor is, right? So this is essentially this process of, the prover is going to run some function. If it's public key cryptography, it's a simple, exponential type function that they can run it. They can do it modulo some large thing. They can do it in polynomial time, right? There's a fast way to compute it forward, right? And so if they solve the equation properly, like if we're sending them, a square root, and they can say, oh yes, that's a root of the equation, right? Then we should be able to have our protocol proceed using that. Okay, I'm going to skip this stuff again, it's like going back and forth about, does it have to be polynomial time? Does it not have to be? The answer is it doesn't have to be polynomial time, but all of us want to do things in our lifetime, so we're going to just ignore the stuff that's not polynomial time. So this makes sense. If we have this probability after running the process, the transcript forward for a certain number of steps, then we could consider the time as like 1 over that, right? So we're saying that if the probability is 1 out of 1,000, then it takes 1,000 steps. This is kind of a simple statement. Um, might not be exactly that, but they want to introduce this kind of interesting property, which is the error function on the knowledge extraction. So how much error do we expect there to be? And really that's what we're doing, right? So we've computed all these steps and we want to run the process and include this error characteristic. So we were talking earlier about different kinds of errors that could occur. And so what we said was, oh, well, we would expect that if the probability is p, then it's 1 over p is going to be like the number of steps or the time. But if you include maybe p is reduced by some error, right? That we're seeing some noise in the signal. There's negligible factors, possibly non-negligible factors. We subtract that out. So we're going to see that we need to take that portion out, and it's going to affect how much running time there is. And so you might think about it from like a signal to noise perspective, right? If the noise kappa is bigger than the probability p, then you're never going to converge on a solution. So this is a challenge of these probabilistic proofs, right? So I'm saying after 10 coin flips, you're going to be convinced. But if 1 out of 2 coin flips gets destroyed by, bad cellular, you can't hear the answer, right? There's some noise in the process. Well, now you can no longer make the protocol work that way. Right now there's some noise that's destroying your ability to converge, and if that noise is too large, it may completely prevent the protocol from working. And one of the things that that needs to be stated is that the proof can work or it can not work. It's not guaranteed to work, right? So what we're stating here is, hey, we'll set up all these conditions. We think if it's favorable, we'll drive it to work in polynomial time. But it might not be driven in polynomial time because of these noise issues. But that doesn't mean anything, right? But if the proof works, you know that the prover knows the information. But if the proof didn't work, it could be this noise that's just making everything not work very well. All right, so this is it. This is what we've been trying to get to the whole time. And so in a way, this is kind of a restatement. So let's go through this all, and maybe we can kind of just hopefully understand this. I think we understand this. This is the whole paper. Sorry, my voice is not working very well. All right, definition 3.1, systems of proofs of knowledge. So let R be a binary relation, true or false. Let the verifier be some interactive function that's computable, polynomial time. So we say that a verifier is a knowledge verifier on that relation, on that true or false statement, with an error kappa, if the following 2 conditions hold. Okay, and this is really important, and this is the foundation of the whole science. So non-triviality is their way to say it. It says there exists some function that's the prover, so that some fact in the knowledge space, in the language is a better way to refer to it, all of the possible inputs are accepting. Okay, I flipped the coin, I sent you a flip, you said it was flipped. Okay, it's just everything works. And so we agree. The transcripts agree. And so the modern lingo for this is called satisfying. Okay, so that the system has to be satisfying. If there's no solution in the system that satisfies the relation, well, obviously it's not a very good system, right? If you can't get a yes out of it, is what it's saying, then it doesn't work. And so that's important. And then, so in contrary to that, validity. So it has to be valid. So there exists some machine, the knowledge extractor, that for every interactive function that's a prover of some fact in the language, then the knowledge extractor has this characteristic. And it's basically the idea is that if the the thing is greater, so the probability is defined to be the probability of that transcript between the two existing in the space is greater than the error, um, and it happens in an expected number of steps that we just talked about, then basically the idea is, maybe it's easier to just put it in words that if the transcript is not part of the space, it will fail. Okay, so these are kind of like two sides of the same coin. One is that there has to be a transcript that can succeed, otherwise there's no point in having this discussion. And then the other side is if it is not the transcript should never be, it has to be falsifiable. That's the word I'm kind of hunting for, that there should be a way for this transcript to not return true if it's not a real signal.
Otherwise, the suggestion is like the error is what's
right. Right. Yeah, exactly. There's either error or false positives or something like that. Right. So these are basically the two fundamental characteristics of proofs of knowledge.
so satisfying and validity.
Yeah, falsifiability or satisfying ability. Okay. So that's the main thing. So I'm going to just kind of go quickly through the rest of this. The rest of the paper is just comments. So that's the work they wanted to do, and now they're going to just kind of comment on it. So we can kind of go through some of that pretty quickly. We've beaten this efficiency question pretty well. I don't think we have to keep going into it. If it's not efficient, if it can't be solved in real time, then we can't really use it. We do need to think about the question of, so when we're doing this process, the challenge is what information becomes publicly available, right? And this is what's leading into like the zero knowledge. This paper is not a zero knowledge paper. This is about just proofs of knowledge in general. But these concepts lead to the idea of understanding what it means to transfer zero knowledge. So that's kind of what they're saying here is that, what we're considering is, the knowledge extractor is operating in a way where, it's just returning a sequence of true false values, right? So that, we have to consider though, what does true mean? Is true somehow revealing information, something that becomes publicly available through that process, then it wouldn't be a secret. But if it's only sharing information that already was publicly available, right? Like my challenge is like, going to be publicly available. And if I only know what was true and respect or false with respect to my challenge, it hasn't like opened up any.
But isn't the idea you could still get information out of that?
No, you shouldn't. And in fact, one of the definitions of like zero knowledge that this paper is not about, but is the idea that you could think of it like the verifier talking to itself. The verifier shouldn't gain any information or any state change as the result of this algorithm. If there was any state change in the verifier as a result of this algorithm, then it wouldn't be zero knowledge. So the whole point is to make like true zero knowledge, like nothing is revealed.
I think I get it. Because the alternative would be like the verifier is able to. I think that makes sense.
Right. So the verifier, is us, right? Think about the verifier as you're going to go out and create a challenge. somebody else, the prover is the suspicious member of the party, right? They're trying to prove that they know somebody, right? Like, oh, I've got, a signature from your friend, right? So you're the verifier. You're gonna be like, oh, what does my friend look like, right? Oh, is their signature flowing or is it just their name? You're gonna start challenging them, right? And if they answer all of your questions,
What does it mean for like the verifier to have this state change?
well, I mean, think about it like, any information is revealed from the algorithm, right? So if any information beyond the authenticity of the question, right, is revealed, then that's the state change.
Makes more sense.
So this is interesting, and maybe this kind of relates to what we were just talking about, that um, this is an important characteristic, that the knowledge extractor is kind of universal. It doesn't matter what proving function, like we've talked about all these different things like coin flipping and non-color blindness and verifying somebody's cryptographic signature or all these kinds of things. So there's kind of a sense that the protocol that we're building should be independent of the provers, the algorithm that we're sharing, right? That a lot of these different kinds of algorithms can all be apropos to it. And that's actually what this is kind of talking to here, I think. Okay. The knowledge error function, I didn't want to get totally into this. I kind of skipped through this while I was reading it. Um, I think it's just a matter of like kind of like thinking this is more of like a mathematical way. Um, we talked about different cases where like the first step there might be an error of 1/2 because you're flipping a coin, right? So it's kind of baked into the problem, and obviously the goal is to drive that error down. It's interesting that they can consider the amount of error, and that's kind of like what's important about this paper is you can start to now think about um, you know how much I accept the proof, including error. So soundness is really important, right? We talked about like satisfiability. Um, if our proof is not sound, right, that's the whole thing is not useful. So the fact has to be in the language, is what it's saying, just in simple terms. If you're somehow convinced that the prover knows the fact and the fact is not in the language, then you've made a grave error in the protocol. So it's not sound, is what you would say. So they're trying to decouple soundless and validity, where I just connected it together. Um, so they talk a little bit about witnesses, and so witnesses are essentially just that's something that can observe the function that we're talking about, the shared function. So if it's a cryptographic protocol, it can do the signature algorithm. It can do the it's the thing that can um, determine the fact of whether or not it's true or false. Okay, so let's go through this example. Maybe that'll be more useful. So Alice wishes to generate a secure remote login to a mainframe. And so this is basically public key cryptography. She chooses a random pair of large prime numbers, multiplies them together, modulo some large number. Um, then she chooses some number at random, sets that to the square, and gives the pair to the verifier. So So then the verifier can challenge with essentially the key. She can know that she knows that square root, right? Because that's a hard problem in theory, right? To find the square root, since she sent the square. Um, Knowing the square root is hard for a very large number. And so she can use that to provide a proof.
And why is the modulo important again? I feel like I remember that from some cryptography class.
Yeah, that's not gonna, it's important for a couple of reasons. One is to control the size of the calculation in the machine, but also all of these, like the mathematical relations work in mod math space as well as they work outside of it. I don't know. I mean, that's a hard question to answer. It's kind of fundamental. Like, it's not, if I just tell you, a large number, it kind of doesn't obscure the fact, right? But if I tell you the large number squared mod some number, then I haven't necessarily revealed to you the the number itself, right? So you could hope that you could write some sort of a, square root function that maybe converges in close to polynomial time if you just know the number itself, right? So it's that secure. But making it modulo some large number, you couldn't do that because you don't have the actual number. Okay, so if the relation here, we're saying that Alice knows the square root, then this is like, it's kind of obtuse way to say it. It proves possession of the witness, right? So that means she knew the secret. Um, okay. So it's kind of a weird example. It's kind of opaque, but maybe it's a little bit helpful. Yeah, I don't understand either why they're trying to separate soundless and the validity. That would be good for a future discussion. I think it's I think it's just like academic stuff. I think they're kind of like pushing the mashed potatoes around on the plate a little bit. All right, this is they're saying like, well, the whole point of this paper, right, was that they're going to include these errors coming from the trivial and non-trivial, and now they're going to undo that, which is kind of funny, and just say, well, it doesn't have to be there. Um, that just like kind of reproduces probably the work from the previous papers that they're looking at. Um, we talked at length about computationally convincing, and this is where they make that statement earlier that I was referring to, that it doesn't have to converge, right? It could, there could be enough error or whatever that it doesn't tell you anything. But if it does tell you something, you should be able to rely on that you've accepted the agreement. And this is also kind of what we talked about quite a bit, right? That, the idea is that, you get more signal if you repeat more trials. Right. So this is defining, like, in general, what proofs of knowledge are. Like, this is like sort of an earlier paper. All right. So that's it. I didn't go through this example. It seemed like another kind of confusing example. Like, I think you guys, you'd be free to read it on your own time and see if you kind of come to anything with it. But that's it. That's the paper. What do you guys think? The really important part, is not all that stuff, but just this one definition 3.1 of what is a proof of knowledge, and that it has these two characteristics that you can see. There's a transcript that exists in the language that's solves the problem. Like, if you have this probability distribution and you're both just sharing a probability distribution, you're not revealing the insights. The probability distribution has to have a signal. It has to have a yes answer where, oh yeah, that's true, right? And it converges on that truth. And by the same token, if someone is just simulating, it has to also have a rejection that, oh, I know your probability distribution. I can just send you, you know, things that I expect are going to work from the probability distribution, then you should be able to reject that I'm doing that. And that's, I mean, what is it? 28 pages for this, for that. So, I'd be welcome to hear any thoughts, corrections, complaints, questions, whatever, discussion points.
Yeah, generally I'm like, I wasn't the best at proofs or kind of these formalized systems in our cryptography class that I took. So I think the way you explained it was definitely pretty helpful in walking through a lot of the basic ideas. I was definitely interested more in like the whole idea of like what types of I don't remember what the function was called, but like what types of events or like binary kind of things like could be used like this. I mean, the coin flip example is always used, but I was trying to think through more avenues.
Right. And so I think you're thinking of like outside. So this is very narrowly scoped, right? That it's talking about binary relations. And so it starts out right from the start of saying, binary relations. I mean, almost anything. Like if you take it out of like the computer space, you could do almost anything. I mean, like we have used multiple examples of like, verify that somebody knows somebody that you know, right? There's all kinds of ways to have this kind of exchange. Verify that a student at a university knows history from the history book that they're supposed to learn, right? You would ask them a series of questions, right? So these are things that are kind of like they're out of that binary space. I mean, you could have a true-false question test, right? That would be an example of that's in a binary space, right? But then you could also have short essay format, right, which would be outside of the binary space. And this is considering, really this is considering practical computation, right? These should be like polynomial step, binary relations. I'm going to challenge you and you're going to tell me yes or no. But I think the idea of the probabilistic proving is really interesting, and I think, like I remember, I think, like from a physics perspective, you always think about, like probability kind of like becomes your friend. Most modern physics involves like statistics more than anything else. And so, I always thought that you needed to have this concept called like, I always used to call it like super zero or something like that, which is like something that's like trivially zero. Like you can imagine, you do this coin flip challenge 10 billion times, right? And the transcript is always correct. At what point do you stop saying it's negligible or a small probability, and just start thinking of it as zero, right? And especially like in like human terms, like we kind of like we don't even realize, but we're kind of like dwarfed by numbers that are around like a billion or maybe like 100 billion. But certainly like once you get on like a universe scale where the numbers are like 2 to 100 or something like that, it starts to become beyond the scope of human reasoning, right? And at that point, I think you can start to say where it's like, okay, the error is zero. Let's just stop talking about it, And
Yeah.
so it's interesting. I mean, and so it's like people tend to be like really uncomfortable, and I'll admit it. Like I'm kind of like uncomfortable with this, sometimes those probabilistic feeling like within a proof or something like that. But I think it's good to get more comfortable with it.
Yeah, definitely agreed. And then my last question was around like the verifier not having a state change or like leaking any knowledge, I guess, as a result of what the prover gives them. Is the general idea there like in the history book example? I don't know if it applies, but like let's say you are trying to make sure as a verifier, let's say you're the teacher, you're asking the student who's the prover questions about whether they have like knowledge about a specific textbook to understand if they've learned, I guess. Wouldn't you be gleaning the information that they have or have not learned through that series of questions
Right,
to the
yeah,
prover?
yeah. So that's certainly not like a binary relation, right?
Yeah,
So, like in the last time I used this example of, how can we like let's develop a protocol to use the strongest cryptographic protocol that we both know, right? And so I would say, like I will take, and again, that's like these are not necessarily binary relations, right? So we're going to get away from that. But like if we just think about the general problem, like let's say this is the example I used the last time, which is let's say I take and encrypt the Declaration of Independence with my strongest protocol that I know, and I'm going to send it to you. And then you're going to take all the protocols that you know, you're going to encrypt it, the Declaration of Independence, until you find a ciphertext that matches mine. And then we're going to both agree. And then you're going to say, once you find the one that matches mine, you're going to return the Declaration of Independence back to me. Now, that's what that line is about, like what's the public information available to the knowledge extractor, right? So you haven't revealed any information to me. But then think about the common ciphertext attack. If someone out there, figures out that the Constitution also encrypts to the same ciphertext, and then they send that to the prover, right? And then the prover is going to return the Declaration of Independence, revealing knowledge that wasn't known before, that wasn't public, right? So now the verifier gained information. They gained the thing that we're using as our challenge. So in that protocol, we've leaked knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. Makes sense.
So it shouldn't be able to work that way, right? If I'm just sending you ones and zeros, and you're just
Yeah.
saying, yeah, I decrypted it, then some bad guy can't come in and use this common ciphertext attack and say, oh, now I know, what you're using. I gained information about you.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. No, that makes sense. Appreciate that clarification. I gotta bounce in like 2 minutes, but
Yeah.
I think
Okay. Any other questions or any discussion points?
No,
Okay.
that was great.
Thanks, guys.
This is to get into it. Cool. Thank you, John.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.